in the shadowy depths of history's darkest archives.
Before gangsters became movie characters and television legends, there was a real man behind the myth. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson. Born in 1905, Bumpy Johnson came into a world where opportunity was defined by race and power was enforced through violence. America was changing, but for black communities like Harlem, change came slowly, if it came at all. Police protection was inconsistent. Political representation was symbolic at best, and survival often depended on who truly controlled the streets. Harlem was not just a neighborhood, it was a pressure cooker. By the early 20th century, it had become the cultural capital of Black America, home to jazz, writers, churches, and ambition. But beneath that surface was another Harlem, one ruled by gambling houses, numbers rackets, and underground economies that filled the void, left by a system that refused to serve its people. This was the Harlem that shaped Bumpy Johnson. The nickname Bumpy came from a noticeable bump on his head, but the name would eventually mean something else entirely. It became a warning, a signal, a line you didn't cross lightly. Bumpy Johnson was not loud. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seek attention. What made him dangerous and respected was control. Control over money, control over people, control over consequences. By the time most outsiders heard his name, he had already become something rare. A black man with real authority in a city where authority was overwhelmingly white. Not symbolic authority, not cultural influence, but practical, enforceable power. Gangsters feared him, politicians dealt with him, and the streets answered to him. To law enforcement, Bumpy Johnson was a criminal mastermind, responsible for gambling, extortion, and violence. To many residents of Harlem, he was something far more complicated. He paid rents for families who were about to be evicted. He helped people find jobs. He enforced rules that the police either ignored or abused. This duality defined his life. Bumpy Johnson lived in the space between villain and protector, between predator and provider. He benefited from crime, yet he also imposed limits, especially when it came to drugs. While he was deeply involved in illegal businesses, he was openly critical of narcotics destroying black neighborhoods. That contradiction would follow him for the rest of his life. What made Bumpy truly unique, however, was not just his influence in Harlem, but the respect he commanded outside of it. Italian Mafia leaders, men who controlled entire cities, chose negotiation over war when dealing with him. They did not see him as a disposable street boss. They saw him as an equal, a man whose cooperation was more valuable than his elimination. That respect was earned through reputation. Bumpy Johnson was known to keep his word. He was known to retaliate when betrayed. And he was known to think several steps ahead. He read books while others carried guns. He quoted Shakespeare and philosophy in a world where most problems were solved with fists or bullets. Intelligence, not impulsiveness, became his signature weapon. Still, his life was never safe. Prison sentences, constant surveillance, and enemies on all sides were part of the cost of power. Yet even when incarcerated, his influence rarely disappeared. Harlem did not forget him, and neither did those who feared what would happen when he returned. So the question remains, even decades later, was Bumpy Johnson a ruthless criminal who exploited Harlem's suffering? Or was he a product of a broken system who used power the only way it was available to him? The answer is uncomfortable, because it is both. To understand Bumpy Johnson is to understand a version of America that existed in the shadows. A place where power was unofficial, justice was selective, and survival required strength. And to understand how he became Harlem's most feared and respected man, we must look at how his rise truly began. Because Bumpy Johnson was not born powerful, he became powerful, one calculated move at a time. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not rise to power by accident. His climb was deliberate, calculated, and shaped by the brutal realities of early 20th century Harlem, where respect was currency and weakness was an invitation to be erased. As a young man, Bumpy was already different from those around him. He was physically intimidating, yes, but more importantly, he was observant. He studied people. He watched how money moved, how fear spread, and how influence was maintained. While others chased fast cash, Bumpy focused on structure. Harlem's underground economy was thriving long before Bumpy took control. Illegal gambling, especially the numbers racket, was deeply embedded in everyday life. For many residents, it was entertainment. For others, it was hope, sometimes the only chance to escape poverty. And for those who controlled it, it was power. Bumpy understood this immediately. Instead of acting like a reckless street enforcer, he positioned himself as a problem solver. He collected debts efficiently, he enforced rules consistently, and he punished betrayal without hesitation. Violence was not his first tool, but it was always an option, and everyone knew it. That reputation spread quickly. People learned that crossing Bumpy Johnson carried consequences, but working with him brought stability. In a neighborhood where chaos was common, stability was valuable. Slowly, gambling operations began to answer to him. Protection rackets followed. Loan sharking filled the gaps where banks refused to lend to black businesses. What made Bumpy's rise unusual was not just how fast it happened, but how organized it was. Unlike many street bosses, he avoided unnecessary attention. He dressed well, but not loudly. He spoke calmly, even when issuing threats. And he built loyalty not only through fear, but through dependability. If Bumpy said something would be handled, it was handled. This discipline allowed him to outlast rivals who relied on brute force alone. Harlem, at the time, was also contested territory. White criminal organizations, particularly Jewish and Italian mobs, had long exploited the neighborhood's underground economy. They often treated local black gangsters as disposable middlemen. Bumpy refused that role. Instead of submitting, he consolidated. By the 1930s and 1940s, Bumpy Johnson had become the central figure in Harlem's illegal operations. He wasn't everywhere, but nothing significant happened without his approval. His name became a form of insurance. Mentioning it could stop a fight, delay a robbery, or open a door that would otherwise remain closed. Law enforcement noticed, but stopping him proved difficult. Bumpy was careful. He insulated himself from day-to-day crimes. He delegated. He kept distance. And when arrests came, he treated prison as a temporary setback, not an end. Each time he returned, his reputation only grew stronger. But power came at a price. Enemies watched closely. Younger gangsters wanted his position, and white mob leaders debated whether Harlem should remain under a black man's control. Any misstep could have triggered a war Bumpy knew Harlem would lose, so he made a strategic decision that would define the next phase of his life. Instead of fighting the Mafia, he would negotiate with them. That choice would elevate him beyond a local kingpin and place him into the highest circles of organized crime in America. Because when Bumpy Johnson stepped beyond Harlem, he wasn't asking for permission. He was offering something far more valuable: order, access, and profit. And that offer caught the attention of one of the most powerful men in criminal history, Lucky Luciano. In the world of organized crime, alliances are rarely built on trust. They are built on leverage. When Bumpy Johnson's name began circulating beyond Harlem, It reached men who were accustomed to absolute control, men like Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the architect of modern American organized crime. Luciano didn't rule through emotion or ego. He ruled through structure, efficiency, and profit. And when he looked at Harlem, he didn't see culture or history. He saw opportunity. For decades, Italian crime families had exploited Harlem's underground economy while maintaining distance from its people. Black neighborhoods were profitable, but unstable. Violence was unpredictable. Local leaders were often unreliable. What Luciano needed was not dominance. It was order. Bumpy Johnson understood that perfectly. Their relationship was not one of master and servant, as many expected. It was transactional and remarkably equal. Bumpy did not beg for recognition. He negotiated from a position of strength, offering Luciano something no outsider could provide: total control of Harlem's operations without constant warfare. In exchange, Bumpy demanded autonomy. He would run Harlem. He would handle disputes. He would ensure profits flowed consistently. And the Mafia would respect Harlem as his territory. This was unprecedented. At a time when black gangsters were routinely sidelined or eliminated, Bumpy Johnson was treated as a partner. That respect was not given. It was earned. Luciano knew that removing Bumpy would destabilize Harlem and cost more than it gained. Cooperation was simply better business. With Mafia backing, Bumpy's power solidified. Money moved faster. Protection became formalized. Conflicts were resolved through negotiation instead of bloodshed. Harlem, while still dangerous, became predictable, and predictability is the lifeblood of organized crime. But this alliance came with tension. Bumpy walked a dangerous line. To Harlem residents, he could not appear controlled by white mob bosses. To the Mafia, he could not appear disloyal or weak. Any sign of betrayal from either side could have ended violently. So Bumpy relied on what had always defined him: discipline. He kept his word. He delivered profits. And when violence was necessary, it was precise and purposeful. Stories spread of Mafia soldiers backing down when Bumpy entered a room, of negotiations ending the moment he spoke, of men with guns choosing not to use them because escalation was bad for business. Yet even as his influence peaked, the government closed in. Federal investigators understood the threat Bumpy represented, not just as a criminal, but as a symbol. A black man negotiating as an equal with the Italian Mafia challenged the unspoken racial hierarchy of American crime. That made him dangerous in ways beyond the streets. Arrests followed, long sentences, transfers to maximum security prisons, including Alcatraz. Many believed that would end him. They were wrong. Prison did not strip Bumpy Johnson of power. It refined it. From behind bars, he continued to influence decisions on the outside. Messages traveled. Orders were obeyed. His reputation grew, not as a reckless gangster, but as a man whose reach extended beyond walls and guards. Still, time changes everything. The Mafia evolved. Harlem changed. New drugs flooded the streets. Younger men cared less about codes and more about chaos. And the balance Bumpy had maintained for decades began to crack. The alliance that once stabilized Harlem now existed in a world Bumpy barely recognized, and the man who ruled through discipline was about to face his greatest contradiction. Because the empire he built was profitable, but it was also destroying the community he claimed to protect. That conflict would define the final chapters of his life. Prison was supposed to break Bumpy Johnson. That was always the government's strategy. Remove the man, isolate him, and let his empire collapse without leadership. Over the course of his life, Bumpy was arrested repeatedly, convicted on serious charges and sentenced to long stretches behind bars. He served time in some of the harshest prisons in America, including Sing Sing and later Alcatraz, a place designed to erase influence as much as freedom. But Bumpy Johnson was not built like other men. For him, prison was not the end of power. It was a test of it. Even while incarcerated, his name still carried weight on the streets of Harlem. Decisions were delayed until word came back from Bumpy. Disputes were handled cautiously because no one wanted to face the consequences once he returned. Guards noticed it. Other inmates noticed it. Bumpy moved through prison not as a broken criminal, but as a man temporarily removed from his territory. What separated him from many gangsters was how he used his time. Bumpy read constantly. Philosophy, history, poetry. He wrote letters. He reflected. Those close to him later said prison sharpened his thinking rather than hardened his heart. He understood that brute force had limits, and that survival required adaptation. But while Bumpy was evolving, Harlem was changing without him. The post-war years brought new drugs into American cities, especially heroin. Unlike gambling or numbers, drugs hollowed out neighborhoods from the inside. Addiction spread fast. Families collapsed. Violence became more random, less controlled. Bumpy hated it. Despite being deeply involved in organized crime, he drew a firm line when it came to narcotics in Harlem. He openly criticized drug dealers who preyed on their own community. He saw drugs not as business, but as destruction. To him, there was a difference between exploiting vice and annihilating a people. That belief created a contradiction he could never fully escape. Because even if Bumpy opposed drugs morally, his alliances and infrastructure made it impossible to completely stop them. Younger criminals didn't share his code. They wanted fast money, not long-term stability. And the Mafia, now more distant and corporate, cared less about Harlem's internal damage than its profitability. When Bumpy was released from prison in the 1960s, he returned to a Harlem that barely resembled the one he had ruled. The streets were more chaotic. The rules were weaker. Respect was harder to enforce. And the generation that feared his name was aging or gone. Still, Bumpy tried. He intervened in disputes. He pushed back against drug dealers where he could. He used his remaining influence to stabilize what was left of his empire. But time was undefeated. The system he once mastered was no longer built for men like him. Even so, his presence mattered. Younger gangsters still watched their tone when he entered a room. Politicians still took his calls. And Harlem residents still recognized him as a man who, for better or worse, had once imposed order when no one else would. Bumpy Johnson lived with the weight of contradiction until the end. He was a criminal who believed in limits, a violent man who valued restraint, a kingpin who saw himself as a guardian. Those contradictions did not redeem him, but they defined him. And when his life finally came to an end, it didn't arrive in a blaze of gunfire or public chaos. It ended quietly, but the impact of his life would echo long after his heart stopped beating. Because Harlem never forgot Bumpy Johnson, and America never stopped debating what he truly was. On July 7, 1968, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died the same way he had lived, quietly, without spectacle. Sitting in the Wells restaurant in Harlem, he suffered a fatal heart attack. There were no gunshots, no police sirens, no dramatic last stand. For a man whose life had been shaped by violence and power, his death was almost unsettling in its simplicity. Yet the reaction in Harlem was anything but quiet. Word spread quickly. Conversations stopped. People lowered their voices, not because they were afraid, but because an era had ended. Bumpy Johnson had outlived most of his rivals, survived prison, and navigated decades of shifting power. With his death, Harlem lost a figure who had defined its underground order for nearly half a century. There was no official mourning, no statues, no public honors. But there was respect. Residents remembered the man who paid rent when families faced eviction. The man who enforced rules when chaos threatened to take over. The man who, despite his crimes, believed Harlem should not be destroyed from within. Others remembered something darker, a criminal who profited from illegal economies and violence, regardless of intent. Both memories were true. After Bumpy's death, Harlem changed rapidly. The structures he maintained collapsed. Drug trafficking intensified. Younger criminals filled the vacuum, but without his discipline or restraint. What followed was not liberation, but fragmentation. The underground economy continued, only now without a central figure to regulate it. In hindsight, many would argue that Bumpy Johnson's greatest power was not fear, but balance. He had balanced crime with control, profit with restraint, loyalty with punishment. When that balance disappeared, the consequences became clear. Beyond Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's influence took on a different life. His story began circulating in books, street lore, and later film and television. He became a symbol, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes misunderstood. To some, he was portrayed as a gangster with a moral code. To others, as proof that systemic racism created its own forms of authority. Hollywood took notice. While The Godfather was not directly based on Bumpy Johnson, his life contributed to the broader archetype of the American crime boss, strategic, respected, and deeply tied to his community. Decades later, the television series Godfather of Harlem, starring Forrest Whitaker, brought his story to a new generation, blending history with dramatization. But the real Bumpy Johnson existed somewhere between legend and reality. He was not a hero. He was not a simple villain. He was a product of his environment, and a man who mastered it. His life forces uncomfortable questions. What happens when the law fails an entire community? Who fills the vacuum when justice is absent? And can order imposed through crime ever truly protect those it claims to serve? Bumpy Johnson did not solve those problems, but he exposed them. He demonstrated that power does not always wear a uniform, that influence can exist without legitimacy, and that leadership, even in the shadows, shapes lives long after the leader is gone. Today, Bumpy Johnson remains one of the most complex figures in American criminal history. Studied, debated, and reimagined, his name still carries weight, especially in Harlem, where memory runs deeper than records. In the end, Bumpy Johnson was not just a gangster. He was a mirror of America's contradictions: race and power, crime and community, order and corruption, colliding in one man. And that is why, decades later, his story still matters.